The world is an old woman, and mistakes any gilt farthing for a gold coin, whereby, being often cheated, she will thenceforth trust nothing but the common copper. Thomas Carlyle. Welcome to this week's episode of Warfare, Advancement, and Revisionism. My name is Preston Floyd, and as always, I'm your host. I'd like to thank you all for joining me here this week. We're going to be going back to our regular history episodes for a while, so I hope you enjoy. And we will be continuing to talk about the native groups in North America, or I should say the ancestors of the native groups of North America. Specifically, we will be talking about groups further east. We then might go ahead and move in south of the Rio Grande towards what is now modern Mexico and the countries of Central America to talk about the groups there. Though depending on the timing, we may not move there until next week. But depending on how much I covered this week, we will probably have another between 1 to 3 episodes of talking about North America at our current time period. And then we'll move to South America, and I think it'll probably be around the same number of episodes. So we'll be finishing out this season here shortly, here in the next couple of weeks. Excuse me. And then we'll go ahead and we'll kind of do those little episodes talking about domestication, crops, that kind of thing, get a little bit specific on it, of course one on animals, and then we'll be talking about some other subjects that will be becoming more important for the next season. And I'm still working out what the time frame for next season is going to be. I wouldn't necessarily like it to be longer than this season, longer than the 8,000 to 6,000, but it might be, if only because that will essentially move us kind of into the next period of human advancement. But we'll talk about it. We'll get there. For now, though, let's just get back to talking about the ancestors of modern Native Americans. However, I did have a couple of pieces of feedback, or at least a couple of people had asked me about the appearance of the bow and arrow. The bow and arrow in the Americas. Excuse me, because I had mentioned, of course, that Atlatl, the dart thrower, it emerging, but I didn't talk about the bow and arrow. And I should just go ahead and say that we do not know when the first bows appeared in the Americas. That is a matter of great debate. Right now, the earliest date put forward by anyone of any serious academic, bearing or expertise, gives a date of around 12,000 years ago, which is, of course, 10,000 BC. But the evidence for this is very, very scant. And I think all of the evidence they have found is just smaller stone heads than you would typically find on spears and the like, especially spears used to hunt, larger mammals or larger game. But this evidence could just be, it could be argued that this is just as easily spears for smaller, something like a javelin, as opposed to a full spear, something that would eventually be added to a spear thrower. So there, that's kind of one of the critiques of that very early evidence for bows. And we know we do know that, some groups developed the bow, lost it, and then redeveloped it. And some groups never redeveloped the bow and arrow. I think there's evidence for very early usage of very simple, small, single pieces of wood bows in Australia, and then it just wasn't useful for the type of animals that they were hunting there, so they essentially forgot how to make them and never had to redevelop them because they didn't need to. It was kind of pointless. And we look at bows at places in like South Africa with the Khoisan who use them. Their bows are also very simple, very small, but they have access to very powerful toxins that they can coat their arrows with to help kill, which is not something that you can necessarily find very easily in other places. So, swabbing your arrowhead with these toxins makes it so even if you don't have a strong bow, you can still kill animals and harvest their meat fairly simply. Whereas other places you need a stronger bow to take down larger prey, which is again the primary source of food the primary source of meat for most people. Meat, fur, leathers, that kind of thing. You need something with stopping power, and the early bows, whenever they were made, were simply not strong enough for this. That's why people using them in South Africa and in other places in Africa, they were using these very strong toxins to help knock the animal out, as opposed to deal fatal damage with their arrows. Now, more firm evidence for the bows in North America comes up around 3000-ish BC, when you will see them in the toolkits of Arctic groups, descended from the Proto-Alouettes that we talked about last time. And over the next 1,000 years, you see more evidence of their use further south. And then another 1,000 years or two after that, they appear all throughout North America. Now, there are those that argue that this diffusion theory is far too simplified, and that it is more likely than not that smaller groups, groups further south, again, were using more primitive or simplistic, might be the better term, bows, and that they were invented in those areas and then fell out of use, and then reintroduced or reinvented later by different peoples in other places as an extremely specialized hunting or fighting implement. But these more simplistic designs were phased out very quickly with the introduction of the more powerful bow from the north by groups to the north, obviously. And I think this is probably the more likely theory. I think that the ancestors of natives were using these smaller bows to hunt smaller game, and then in areas where that wouldn't be viable, they didn't bother making bows. However, once these more powerful composite or longer bows were introduced, and they had more power, then you will see them spread either through trade or through just viewing them, seeing them in action. However you could imagine people learning about these weapons and obtaining them. I think that probably helped it spread all throughout the Americas. But we'll talk more about that later, because also it's very possible that the bow and arrow was not initially primarily a hunting implement. But we'll talk about that again when we talk about the Alouettes moving throughout the Americas, or through the Arctic Circle and the northern reaches of Canada, Alaska, those areas. So that's something for us to go back to. Now let's go ahead and move and talk about the humans. Get back on the primary part of this episode's focus, and that's talking about the humans living east of North America. And in this case, by east, I mean east of the Mississippi River, and that includes places in Canada, not just in the continental U.S. Now, this region was probably probably had a much lower population density than the areas to the west that we talked about last time. And this area was and is much more heavily forested than the Great Plains and Rockies, though, of course, large pine forests did recede some after the Younger Dryas. And the areas where they were treated from were replaced by deciduous trees. And these are things like oaks, maples, sweet gum, I think, is another big important tree that's kind of, taking the place of these larger pines. And of course, these types of trees provided more nuts and increased the the warmer weather. It also allowed the increase of the number of bushes and shrubs that provided wild fruit and berries and that sort of thing. And of course, as we've talked about many times, there are, gathering makes up a much larger portion of the Homo sapien diet at this point in time. So these types of forage are extremely important. But, of course, because there's so much more of it, it allows these people to maintain a more traditional hunter-gatherer lifestyle than places further to the west and south. Of course, in the west, they're supplementing their diet with a lot more fish and marine foodstuffs. Not to say they weren't fishing, of course, in the east, but it's not quite as much of their diet. And in the south, it's of course more tolerable. It's not nearly as hot and dry in those regions at our current time, or the time frame we're talking about. But it is still not as green and lush as it is in these other places. So they're having to get a little bit more creative to get a lot of food there. Excuse me. Sorry, I was going back through my notes, trying to find my place here. Of course, also, this abundance of nuts and fruits and things like that, of course, are going to allow for a lot more animals than places to the south, which, of course, makes it a better place to find these larger animals like deer and things like that. So, that's important to keep in mind, too. And again, fewer animals, a little bit less forage. Again, it causes these people in the south, that we'll be talking about later, to kind of have to, again, get creative. Whereas the people in the eastern North America, they're able to kind of continue the very, long-standing human traditions of hunting and gathering for a much longer period. They don't feel pressure to change their lifestyle, or at least nearly as much pressure to change their lifestyle. Excuse me. Sorry. Also, of course, we talked about it a little bit last time, but the extinction of the megafauna also allowed these smaller animals more opportunity to thrive. Not only is there more food because the weather is better, there's also more food because there's less competition from these large, things like mammoths and things like that. Also, there are bison in this area as well. In most modern Americans' understandings, of the continent before the Europeans arrived, we tend to think of the bison as an animal of the West and Great Plains. But at this earlier period, there would be smaller herds east of the Appalachians and into what is now New England and like eastern Canada. Though, of course, deer and smaller game are making up a much higher portion of, or they take up more space and are probably a much larger portion of meat consumption by eastern groups due to the bison herds being smaller. Um, and I can't remember if I mentioned it last time, but domesticated dogs were present with these peoples, and they would be used for hunting, fighting off wolves, coyotes in certain areas, and of course they'd be helping keep watch, companionship, and I'm sure in other places, or I'm sure as in other places, they would be a food source in desperate times if it came to that. And again, fish would also make up an important part of their diet. Though again, most of the fish these people are eating are probably a much smaller variety from the places to the west, and also there's a lot more freshwater fish as opposed to saltwater or sea fish. They're getting them from lakes, ponds, and all of the rivers of the that make up the Mississippi River system, which is just massive. It's hard to kind of convey how many rivers and streams feed into the Mississippi in some way or another. In terms of plants, of course, they had access to, again, we talked about nuts, berries. They also had wild vegetable precursors, or at least plants that are, essentially vegetables. Also, they had seeds, wild seeds. That's not something I usually mention, but that is something that people everywhere are mentioning. They're not always replanting. They were not necessarily replanting seeds early on. This is something that when they're not replanting them, they're just eating them, grinding them up into flours and things like that. I'm sure help cook. But they could also be roasted or put on fires to kind of cook. Sunflower seeds, of course, very popular even today. And of course, a lot of what they're eating in terms of plants are either identical to what they were having that we talked about last time, or they're cousins of the varieties that we talked about in the Pacific Northwest. And of course, nuts all around. Those would mostly be in the forested areas. Berries could grow, in forest, but they're also near water sources, plains, hills, near lakes and ponds and that kind of thing. In terms of rainfall, it's probably very similar to what it is today. Maybe a little bit wetter, but by and large, the eastern portion of North America, very, very close to what it is today. Maybe a little bit cooler, but not by a super noticeable degree. Now, I would like to talk about specific sites during this time because there are a decent number, that you could find throughout the modern U.S. and Canada. That said, I'm not really going to be going into too much detail on these sites. And the reason being for this is that at this early date, the 8,000 to 6,000 range, there isn't really anything to distinguish these sites from each other. They're not part of a monolithic culture like Clovis, and when I say culture, I mean like tool culture. There is not any kind of thing that ties them all together, but there isn't really much to distinguish these sites from each other. There are small variations to tools and cultural artifacts and things like that, but by and large, there's enough differences to make you think, well, are these really related? But they're also not radically different enough to be like, are these people completely separate? So at this early stage, there is almost nothing to tie in any of these peoples to either each other or to later groups that are going to have much more unique and distinct artifacts But again, that's something that doesn't emerge until after this season ends. Excuse me. But I should say some of these sites that are at this part of the season, 8,000 to 6,000, that are being seasonally occupied for a year or two, or maybe a couple of months out of the year, they will eventually become sites of permanent settlement, or at least, if not these sites directly, maybe there's a location a mile or two away that do become sites of permanent settlements. And these older sites are either used as kind of like a secondary location, or maybe they're it's put into like a position of honor, or maybe a aspect of worship or something along those lines. For an example, there is the site known as Indian Knoll in Kentucky. And I think right now the oldest material there has been that can be firmly dated can be dated to about 5,000 BC. But of course, due to the nature of the materials that the artifacts are made from, and due to the very relatively small size of groups in this part of the continent, it is very possible that these sites were being used much earlier, and that, again, due to the nature of the materials and all that kind of stuff, that it would be very hard to find stuff that can be dated earlier, just because how they're making tools and what they're making the tools with just wouldn't last in the archaeological record from an earlier period. But they have found some small pieces that they think could be older than 5,000. It's just there's nothing to really test them against. So that is something to keep in mind. It is, again, very likely that there are... Well, we know for a fact that virtually everywhere in the continental eastern U.S. and Canada has Homo sapiens living somewhere in that region. The question is, how long were they living there, and how numerous they were, and when did this change, or when did they change from being mobile hunter-gatherers to slightly more sedentary groups, and when did they begin to kind of develop their own unique styles and cultures and work, crafts, essentially, tools, that kind of thing. When did they begin developing true variations of these things? When did these new regional groups coalesce? It's probably not at this earlier period, but it is something that's going to be happening in the next season. Also, I can't remember if I've mentioned or not, but the islands of like the Caribbean and places like that further to the south of Florida and the Gulf Coast, those places are not occupied yet. They will not be occupied for another couple of thousand years. That happens later. So keep that in mind as well. But there is one group that basically goes against everything I just talked about in terms of there's not a whole lot to distinguish them from each other. And that is a group known as the Old Copper Culture. Now, if you were to ask most people, at least in America, and I'm assuming a lot of other people in other parts of the world that know anything about the Americas, they would not assume that groups in North America had any type of knowledge or skill with metalworking. Of course, very famously, when the Spanish arrived to Mesoamerica, the Aztecs did not have iron or steel weapons. The same is true of the North American groups. When the Spanish and the French and the English showed up, they did not have that type of technology. So people are usually stunned to find out that there is a group that is working metal in North America. Of course, there are people who are aware that groups like the Aztecs and the Mayans and the Incas worked gold and silver. But again, they weren't using other metals for tools. And this process did, again, take place in North America as well. Specifically, I think the main kind of nucleus of this culture will form on... there's a peninsula off... if you look at a map of the modern U.S., the state of Michigan looks like a glove or a mitt. And then it also kind of has an unconnected peninsula. This is sometimes referred to as the Upper Peninsula. On that peninsula, there is a smaller peninsula, and this is called the Keweenaw Peninsula. And this isn't the only place, but there are plenty of others around, like the Great Lakes, Lake Superior. I think on the Canadian side near Manitoba, Ontario. These are all kind of places that are generally associated with the old copper culture. And it's important to remember that metals technically are very similar to stone in terms of where they come from. But and the dating on this is a little debated. There are obviously people in the area, at this time frame. I think around 7,500 is the first time that they're really getting solid dates of people being in the region. But this group, or at least people following this tradition of using copper, will remain for quite a while. Though, of course, there are going to be changes in the makeup and languages and all that kind of stuff, and how or what types of tools are going to be made, that kind of thing. But by and large, this region is going to be very prominent in kind of, I guess the best term for it is prestige goods. Though I should again point out that they weren't just using copper to make fancy items, though they were, and that was a big part of of their importance. But they were using copper for tools, practical purposes as well. But it's very easy to kind of focus on the more elaborate designs that were found in areas, and it's very clear, or at least extremely likely, that they were used for more ceremonial or more maybe a display of power or prestige, as opposed to just practicality. These copper crafts will very because again they are very beautiful, they are very well designed, they are going to be kind of status symbols, at least for a period. And that's something we see in other places. Copper tools, copper weapons do become, status symbols in other areas as well. This isn't that surprising. It's something that's very different from what most people would have access to. And I believe I've mentioned before in other places again that you had copper in what's I think modern Iran, Iraq, and there are a couple of places in Europe that you have small, again, very rudimentary items, raw copper kind of taken out, mined out of the ground. However, in North America, the situation is a little bit different. The copper here in that area, was extremely pure. In some cases, as pure as 99% copper. Excuse me. And initially, they had veins of the material just on the surface. They didn't have to dig into the sides of cliffs or dig up the ground. They just had veins of copper just coming out of the earth. So, and they were able to kind of break out chunks fairly easily at first. And then from there, because it's so pure, they didn't have to smelt it, which is something that that has to be done in places in the old world, at least very early copper discoveries. But essentially, the native groups process. They're working it cold. Essentially, they're shaping it. They're doing cold rolling, which is again something I'll talk about when I get to the metallurgical episodes and explanation stuff. They don't necessarily have to invent these blast furnaces to smelt out the impurities in the copper. It's just something that for them it's very easy to do. Now, of course, as time progresses, they will, of course, kind of develop their own quarries and mines and things like that to get at more copper. But as far as I know, they never developed any kind of smelting or like blast furnaces or molds to make items. This is almost all done by hand shaped, by banging it out on stone or with other kinds of rocks. Which in other parts of the Americas, that is, again, something that's done with gold and silver. Although I think that some of those places did eventually make molds and things like that. I don't think there's ever been any evidence found for copper culture sites where that was done. I think there are people who are convinced that they had at least some level of smelting technology, but there's never been any hard evidence, and I think all the artifacts we have found from the copper cultures, and there's a lot of them, and again, you can find all types of things. Fish hooks, kind of adze, which are like those very crude rudimentary hoes that you would use to dig up and till soil, that kind of thing. So, but we'll continue to talk about the old copper culture. Again, at this early stage, they're just now kind of making more simplistic designs and things like that, and eventually they will become very highly skilled cold metal workers, and their artifacts show up everywhere after a period of time. Trying to think. Now, tests have been done on copper kind of from the region. They were kind of done up in a very similar fashion to the way that stone materials were done by the natives. They found these examples of both copper and stone tools from peoples living in those regions, and they recreated these designs with just brand new. They created them from scratch, but just copying essentially the designs. And what they found was that copper as a weapon, or as say a spearhead versus a stone spearhead, they're about equal. They're neither is clearly superior to the other. So we'll talk about it more later as we progress, through, the seasons. But again, copper is not a clearly better material to use for survival than some stones are. And kind of the reason that copper becomes popular is because of its aesthetics, as opposed to necessarily its usefulness. It's not necessarily better than stone. It just generally has a better look, as opposed to a more effective, or just it's not as effective, or it's not any more effective, I think is the best way to put it. It just looks better, essentially. That's why copper initially becomes popular. But again, when we get to metallurgy, I'll talk about how the difference in copper in these locations kind of changes how technology evolves going forward in the various regions. But the copper culture is definitely the standout of the North American groups at this period. There are again going to be more regional groups that become very distinct in the next couple of seasons, and they'll of course tie in with each other. And some copper artifacts will be very far south and very far east and west as well. But yeah, so that was something, doing research for this show is I learned a lot about that I didn't know about at all. Because again, typically, I think most people learning about history, they understood that the natives did not have the same level of weaponry, and indeed they didn't even have iron for armor or things like that. That's part of the reason that they lost to clearly inferior numbers, at least when it comes to the Spanish attacking the Aztecs. Now, there are other factors that we will get into far in the future. That's not the only reason they lost. It's just a small contributing factor, but we'll get into that again in the future. But that is something that I was surprised about, that there were groups in the Americas, even at this early date, working copper. In fact, they're working copper into more elaborate designs than in other places at the same time. Again, because these other places don't have access to as pure copper. They're having to learn how to smelt out the impurities to really get good, useful pieces to create. Here, that's not the problem. It's easy to get, or at least relatively easy to get, mine out, and then they get to basically experiment. And one of the great things about metal, as opposed to other stone, if it breaks, you can eventually rework it, into maybe something smaller, maybe something different, and then later, of course, in other areas, you can melt it down and recast it, reforge it into a different item by combining it with more material. So we'll get to that all going forward. Let's see. About 40 minutes. I think this is kind of a good place to call it. I don't want to seem like they're not important places. There are important places in the eastern North America. However, again, they're just all kind of the same. Now, if you really wanted to dive in deep on this, there is a lot of good academic papers you can read where there's a lot of debates about, this site is clearly belonging to this group, or this site belongs to that group, or no, both of these sites both belong to this group and not that group. Literally, you could do a couple of hours on this. However, this is an audio format, and again, I am not an archaeologist. I do not know enough about very specific minutia and points and arrow designs and bifurcated and non-bifurcated points to really get to dive too deep on this. There's going to be a lot more to talk about here in North America. But at this early date, there's just so much that's still debated and so much that isn't clear. I think it's just easier to kind of just, again, sum up. You've got a small number of people who are moving into this region. They are able to continue the hunter-gatherer lifestyle much more simply than groups to the southwest and Mexico, Central America. They're able to continue this traditional lifestyle, and this is great for them because their population does grow, and it grows pretty steadily. Like most hunter-gatherer groups, I think it's like 100 years, your population will double. They kind of had that going with them too. And that's not something that groups to the south could necessarily take part in, at least not at first. So I wouldn't be surprised to see, like, maybe between the 10,000 BC to 8,000, that these first peoples moving into the east might be catching up to some of their neighbors to the west and south. But, as we will talk about in the next episode, these people will begin to develop agriculture, which, again, is something that we know has been happening in the Middle East and parts of East Asia. But, of course, in Mesoamerica, you have the kind of the origin of agriculture in the Americas. And we'll talk about that next episode. There's a lot of crops that we'll be talking about, and we'll be talking about the peoples who are learning how to use that and then spreading it. But yeah, so and it's them adapting this fully sedentary lifestyle that allows them essentially to have a population explosion, probably putting them again ahead of the groups from the east who had maybe been slowly catching up to, or maybe even slightly starting to outpace them. But the origins of agriculture in the New World is going to be very key factor for the next couple of seasons here in the Americas. I mean, it's true in the Old World as well, but there's a lot of other factors contributing there. But the various types of crops being developed in Mesoamerica, and then spreading out from there, and then, as we'll talk about in South America, there are some more crops being developed, and there's a lot more. I feel like, to talk about the spreading, like what spreads where and why, whereas in the Old World, it's very clear why these things are spreading where they are. I think in the Americas, you have a little bit more nuance there. At least that's just kind of how I've read it, kind of how I see it. But I might be wrong. That just could be me, kind of coloring my understanding with my own personal kind of worldview. But we'll talk about it. You guys might agree, you guys might disagree. But regardless, I do thank you all for joining me this week. I know I got a little rambly at a couple of places. But I hope you've enjoyed. Again, we'll have 1 to 3 more episodes here in North America, and then we'll move south. So, and I'm still working on, again, the time frame for the next season. But yeah, we'll figure it out. You guys will be able to find out what happens, and yeah. If you have any questions or feedback, constructive criticism, please feel free to email me at war@revpod@gmail.com. You can also direct message me on X or Twitter, whatever you want to call it. I'll have a link for that on the episode description. And of course, you can always comment on any of my YouTube videos. I do occasionally live stream on YouTube during the week, sometimes on the weekends, but usually during the week. If you ever have a question, feel free to stop by if I'm live, or just comment on any of the videos, and I will read them and respond there. But yeah, I'd like to thank you all again. I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and I hope you have a good rest of your week. Thank you all. Goodbye.